Today's episode of the Energy Newsbeat podcast is brought to you by Enverus. The energy industry faces massive challenges every day, and the events over the last 2 years have caused huge disruptions like never before. Companies in the energy industry need actionable intelligence and a single source of truth that brings all the data together. Enverus is the energy specialized technology partner that provides intelligent connections for a global energy ecosystem. Only Enverus has the analytics, people, experience, and industry scope to connect the right data and information in the right way to discover missed opportunities and deliver fast outcomes. Find out more at Enverus.com. That's ENVERUS.com.
Good morning, everybody. I'll tell you, besides being a great day, today's Friday. So, we're off and running. And my name is Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group. And I got a really cool treat today. I got two experts from Enverus, and we've got Heather Leahey. And Heather, you're up in Canada today, aren't you?
Up in Canada. Yeah, it's a beautiful day out in Canada. I'm worried it might snow eventually in the next few weeks, but for right now, it's quite warm. So I'll take it.
Now, how cool. You're up in Calgary, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And we got Graham Bain. And how are you today, Graham?
Oh, I'm doing great. Yeah, like you said, it's Friday. Going out to BC over the weekend to the lake. So nice. It's a great day for sure.
I'm assuming that's British Columbia.
Yes, British Columbia. Yeah, province
right.
over from where we are.
Calgary is one of my favorite towns. So, when I go up there, I'll buy you guys some dinner. So, anyway, you guys are with one of my most favorite companies, Enverus, and I'll tell you, if you are in the energy sector and you need data, there's only one Enverus, and there's only one all the way around. So I'm over here like a big cheerleader. I need pom-poms because you guys just absolutely rock. But we're going to talk about CCUS, and we've got some other things because you guys had a really good analyst report that came out just a little bit ago, and we're also going to say both of you, I think, saw this article. I was sneaking a look at your LinkedIn articles, and this was from David Blackmon. It was the article on CCUS and LNG. So, Heather, could you tell us a little bit about CCUS? Tell us what you think of it, and then how that would fit into the LNG world.
For sure. Yeah. So CCUS, we'll start from the basics. That's carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So capturing CO2 from emitters, all the way to then utilizing it. Could be for oil production, could be for other fuels, materials, but largely for sequestering it permanently. And just a little bit of kind of interesting background on how the space has evolved, and that, call it 3 years ago, barely anyone was talking about CCUS. And now here we are in 2022. It's been a wild ride. We've seen a surge in interest over the last, call it 2 years, but even more so in the last 6 months. And this is even before the Inflation Reduction Act passed. So now we're seeing lots of activity, lots of project announcements, a lot of which has been motivated by, net zero commitments, by policy that's strengthened, and this whole idea of stakeholder capitalism. And what started it in a couple, different particular sectors. We saw this initially, quite a bit in power, potentially a little bit in natural gas, but now we're seeing it expand to a number of different sectors and subsectors, including LNG, especially as we're seeing this focus on decarbonization and cleaning up our supply chains. More and more demands from European customers. They want this product, but with a low carbon kind of approach to it. Right. So 2022 so far has been a big year. Announcements on the LNG side, partnering with our LNG projects with CCUS capacity are becoming increasingly common.
Now, when you guys were doing some of these reports and stuff, and Heather, as you're talking about LNG, got to have midstream. How does CCUS fit into the midstream section?
It definitely plays a huge role in the midstream section. Pipelines will be needed to transport CO2 for example, to connect that source to the sink. We're either going to need to see a lot of new pipelines built specifically for CO2, or a lot of old natural gas pipelines are going to need to be retrofitted, right? And yeah, I think we're gonna see a lot of movement in that space, connecting the two.
Well, when you guys, and I'm going to throw this open to both of you, but in the storage aspect of it, we actually use CO2 for a lot of things, and it's actually very usable. Can you guys throw us some ideas on use for storage, and then what it can be used for?
Yeah, so I mean, CO2 has been used for enhanced oil recovery for 3 decades at least. So that is probably its dominant use over the last 30 or so years, actually getting more oil out of the ground. In that sense, you are still storing some of that CO2, but you're also reproducing it. So I can't say that, if you're actually utilizing, say, 1 million tons of CO2 for an EOR project, that 1 million tons isn't fully going to be stored. You're still going to produce some of that out, separate it from the oil that you produce, or the gas that you produce in that sense, and then you're still re-injecting it. If you're talking other utilization cases, things that I'd say are newer, looking at cement production using CO2 for cement, obviously in soda, beverages, things like that. Just not to the same extent or the same volumes, I think, that we're looking to store here, at least in the permanent side.
I think an important distinction too, just to add on to that, to make is around the fact that we've been using CO2 for so long, but a large part of that has been, natural CO2. We talk about EOR here, and Denbury historically, at least even right now, they use about 70% natural CO2. So they produce it up from the ground, transport it, and then use it for EOR. But really the potential now is, can we capture industrial CO2 and start to make that replacement?
Well, when you sit back and we talk about cement, you guys hit a big one right there with me, and that is coal. A while ago, I didn't know that coal has to be used because of coking coal is one of the few fuel sources that can get cement that hot. And how can CCUS be used in coal?
Yeah, we've seen historically a lot of the projects, like CCUS projects, have been on coal-fired power plants. There's been a lot of government funding for that. So a lot of the DOE funding has gone towards coal-fired power plants. I think there's definitely, potential there. Some of the challenges, though, we've seen very large, cost overruns. And from the economic work that we've done, coal-fired power plants are probably on the high end of the cost curve as far as applying CCUS technology. So kind of the question becomes, like, is this actually a viable customer base for a CCUS project developer? Or is that the segment of the power sector that's going to be replaced with renewables, and maybe a more viable customer base for those technologies on the natural gas fired power plant side?
Well, because Enverus has such great reporting across all of the energy sector. I mean, we're talking grid, we're talking, anything to do with energy. And I keep finding out something new about Enverus every other day. And how does Enverus handle the reporting on CCUS? Because that's got to be a wild animal right there.
Yeah. One of the interesting pieces that makes CCUS so challenging to track, in large part, is that there really isn't. It's not like you report your production to the RRC and the RRC publishes that for the world to see. There really isn't that centralized source at this point in time for tracking all these different projects as far as kind of announcements go. And that's been a focus for us, is can we go through all the public reports and releases and try and get a better picture of what CCUS looks like from a macro perspective. Definitely following a lot of the Class 6 permit I guess saga, historically that's been a very slow moving regulatory process, up to 6 years. And there's talks of moving that forward, but we haven't seen a precedent for that.
Right.
But there are, other data sources at least we can find in terms of screening potential projects. So that could be emissions data, existing infrastructure data, lots of log coverage on the subsurface, and some of the land parcel data as well.
When you guys were in that David Blackmon article we talked about just a little bit ago, we were talking about EIR, and there's so many acronyms out there, IEA, and all those. I always get them confused, but Enverus intelligence research, I think we're talking about the same thing there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I went to Oklahoma State, so I got to keep, fact checking myself there. But when we talk about what you guys do on this, a lot of the storage is down in the Louisiana area. So how did you guys come up with some of those numbers, or is there any other major storage areas in the U.S.?
Yeah, so we, in coming up with those numbers, we heavily leverage wireline log data. So basically the geophysical tools that go down the wellbore to measure the rock properties in the subsurface. And then we'll get a sort of subsurface volume from that and calculate a volumetric of potential CO2 in any one of those formations.
Right.
And so, like you mentioned, Louisiana has a huge amount of storage. The reservoir there is just really fantastic. It's younger rock in the geological sort of history, so it has had less time to compress.
I'm old.
You've got
Graham. What's younger rock? Because Moses and I are buddies.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at rock that's on the order of 50 million years or less, as opposed to say Permian rock in the Delaware, which is 300 million years, right? But it's just generally shallower. At least some of the rock has had less time to compress. You've got really high porosity, so really an ability to store a ton of CO2. But I think additionally, you've got really high permeability, which is the ability for fluid to actually flow in the rock, so to flow away from the wellbore to allow you to actually inject a lot of CO2 at one time. And well, that Gulf Coast area, I mean, not just restricted to Louisiana, but also Texas along the Gulf Coast, those same formations sort of extend out to Texas.
Right.
That whole Gulf Coast area just has a ton of storage, and you can kind of relate it to the sands that have built up some of these offshore oil and gas fields and reservoirs that have really high porosities, can produce a ton of oil out of a single well. It's kind of akin to that kind of rock. Now, with that said, there's still, I think, a ton of storage around the United States as well. It's not just isolated to those sands. It's just generally going to be a different type of reservoir. It might not be quite as porous or permeable, so it might not be able to hold as much CO2 in, say, an isolated area, or be able to support the injection rates. But with more wells, there's still a huge potential for storage in other areas around the US. So that Gulf Coast area isn't the only spot. And I think it's going to need to be utilized because these companies are all flocking to Louisiana, where there are really low cost emitters. There's great storage, but that's going to relate to a lot of competition. And so I think there's a lot of secondary areas with less eyes on them that are going to be very viable targets and very useful targets going forwards.
Well, over in the Haynesville, that's one of the best places in the world for natural gas. So, I mean, that is a very, very nice play. I don't know anything about up there in the Marcellus, where that formation, do you guys know up in Pennsylvania where they would store it up there if they're drilling for oil and gas in the Marcellus?
Yeah, so one of the most talked about intervals is called the Oriskany Sandstone. It's below the Marcellus, but it's not quite.
I'm going to interrupt you for one sec. Lunch with Heather and Graham has got to be absolutely, nobody's going to, interject on y'all on a conversation, walking by, getting a sandwich or something, because y'all are going to be speaking way above everybody else. So I think lunch ought to be just hilarious with you. Anyway, sorry, Graham, keep going. I just didn't mean to interrupt there.
No worries. Yeah, so it's a sandstone. I mean, if you're going to equate it to the sandstone reservoirs in Louisiana, the porosity and permeability, so the ability to actually hold the CO2 is quite a bit lower. So if you're looking at about 35% porosity in those sands in Louisiana, you're probably looking at maybe 12 to 14% in the sense, so less than half that. And then in terms of permeability, it's even a bigger difference. And so permeability is measured on what's called the Darcy scale. And so in the Louisiana
exploded. What is the Darcy scale?
It's really just you can just imagine it as the ability for fluid to flow in the subsurface. And so it's generally recorded on a logarithmic scale. And so in the Louisiana area, you're looking at about 2 Darcy to 8 Darcy permeability. And now in the Oriskany sandstone, you're looking in the millidarcy range. So maybe on average of 10 millidarcies. So orders of magnitude lower ability for CO2 to flow in the subsurface. And so that's going to require more wells to inject the same volume of CO2, which is just going to affect the, say, economic feasibility of these projects. And also with a lot of existing gas fields in the area, and also a lot of deformation in the subsurface, so a lot of faulting and things like that in the Marcellus can add to the risk of CO2 escape. And so generally you've got a more complicated reservoir with a lower ability to flow and just in general lower prospectivity to hold CO2 up there.
Well, Heather, when we talk about the importance of CCUS and getting the ESG people on board for fossil fuels or, drilling or any of those kind of things, how do you see carbon capture being, I don't want to use the word sold, but educated out there? How do you really help? Because it's tough out there because everybody's got they want to shut down fossil fuels, but they don't understand we can't get to carbon net zero without fossil fuels or carbon capture. So how does ESG fit into all of that?
Yeah, for sure. Like, I think an important piece there's definitely backlash towards CCUS with the thought that, we're propagating fossil fuel production. I guess, one piece of it too is I think we've all realized in the last few months challenges around energy security and how can we continue to supply this energy, but also being mindful of the emissions that we're emitting is kind of one piece to it. The other piece, though, too, recognizing that the intent for this technology is not just to support oil and gas operations. There's a variety of different sectors that are benefit, but also as far as like where we've seen project announcements go. And I think there's still a lot of economic, technical merits to CO2 EOR floods. We've just seen a lot of pretty much all the growth we've seen in terms of capacity backlog has been on the permanent sequestration side. It is definitely, and like we can acknowledge that this technology, the capture piece is not new, but the storage side of it, that's a very new piece. And I think definitely can create some hesitations or just concerns because we haven't seen that many storage projects globally. I think we have about 10 million tons per annum of capacity globally. And that's, the IEA has done some work outlining what they think global capacity needs to be, and this is way less than 1% of what that is. So there's just not that many analogs to really wrap your head around. And definitely certain, emitters or parties involved just kind of want to feel a little bit more confident in the technology, which is also kind of where CO2 EOR can come in as that kind of bridge as we're figuring that all out. That's potentially that bridge that supports us in reducing emissions, producing low carbon oil, but then also figuring out that technical piece in the storage side.
And you got to sit back and take a look at CCUS and ESG and the tax credits. How did you look at tax credits in this report?
Yeah, so this report here pretty focused on the US, and it is interesting to kind of contrast the US and Canada. How are we incentivizing these projects? In the US, we're looking more so at like an incentive system. So 45Q is a tax credit.
Right.
As an emitter, if I don't do anything with my, don't capture my CO2, I'm not getting penalized. I just won't get, paid
Right.
to do so, versus in Canada, I'm going to get slapped on the wrist because of the carbon tax there.
Right.
Definitely kind of interesting to see the evolution of drivers behind an emitter's decision to want to capture.
Right.
Because before the Inflation Reduction Act and expanding 45Q up from $50 to $85 per ton, just the economics were hard to go around for a lot of different
Right.
subsectors, but now those, a lot of them are justified at this price point. But the other piece you kind of have to consider, and I don't think we're there yet, but down the road, is kind of more this environmental scrutiny and pressure beyond just financial incentives that might motivate certain behaviors to capture. Because down the road, if you're not, today, if you're not capturing your emissions, implicitly, explicitly, you're not penalized, but maybe that might be the case down the road, where there might be other explicit or implicit penalties for not doing so.
With CCUS, it seems like Occidental is, leading the charge with this. And I got to give the CEO, she's just absolutely grabbing, this whole CCU. In fact, she said that it's going to be, $1 trillion market in this. So when you're forward looking, guys, at this, kind of thing going around the corner, boy, Enverus has got to just sit there and kind of go, how do you get your hands around the future market? Because y'all's data is just, I can say that because I'm from Oklahoma and Texas. So y'all's not a line up there in Calgary, y'all say.
Yeah, we like it.
Yeah, but you say process. I love process.
Yeah, people have pointed that one out. Process is one, and hey, or A.
Yeah.
We say that one a lot too.
Beauty, eh? Anyway, I just, sorry for regressing there. But, when you guys take a look at that, there's some huge market numbers that Enverus has got to look at.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you want to go ahead, Graham?
So you're referring to how do you capture a piece of that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how do you calculate this? Because, the old adage, there is no ESG without accountability. So, if you've got the horrible, people can take advantage of carbon tax credits. And I mean, not long ago, Russia was selling carbon credits for some of their forest. Okay, great. Now that's a scam. I'm like, all right, why didn't I think of that? I guess I'm not smart enough to think of those kind of things, but Putin sure did. And now how do you guys are going to take a look at that? Because Enverus also looks at M&A and also looks at all of those kind of markets. What are y'all seeing with measuring that stuff?
Yeah, I can kind of kick us off or give us a starting point there. As it relates, I'll just kind of start specifically to CCUS. We're at a point where we haven't seen too much, M&A as we're used to or accustomed to in the oil and gas side yet. It's been a lot of new projects, and securing partnerships with emitters or landowners. There are, and I probably can't. I'm not probably the best person to speak to in detail about this, but we're starting to see more and more activity on the power renewable side as well. More demand for tracking that type of activity because the space is moving so quickly. We've seen it in terms of tracking new project announcements, but in terms of tracking transactions as well. It's one, I'm sure we'll come back in a year's time and really the transaction backlog, I'm sure will be quite long. And that's kind of the value in capturing that information, but then applying a certain metric so we can start to benchmark those transactions.
Yeah. And I think just what Heather said with the benchmarking those transactions, I think, looking at the levers that you can pull to improve, say, the economic feasibility of some of these projects in their early life, right? And putting those and displaying those in a way that's incredibly transparent to understand what that sort of, say, if you're talking about the price of carbon, what the price of carbon needs to be to make any of these projects economical, especially on the capture side, right?
Right. Okay. Graham, I loved your LinkedIn profile when I was sitting there looking at that, because I love oil sands. Oil, sands, because it's, it's heavy. We need that heavy oil bad, and I'd rather buy heavy oil from Canada rather than Saudi Arabia or Iran. And California is buying Iran and Saudi. 25% of theirs was from those two. And why are we buying oil from a sanctioned countries when we can buy from Canada? I'm like, this is not rocket science. But on your experience with oil sands, how do you capture it up in specifically that sands area? And I want to back up a little bit on Canada. Your regulations up there are tough, but there also means that I think Canada's doing the most good out of, being ESG and doing things right, a lot of things right up in Canada for drilling and saving the environment. But how do you work on the sands kind of a gig there?
Yeah, I mean, looking at how you capture the oil out of the sands.
There's such a black eye about oil sands, because you always see, you
mostly see mines, you mostly see, I guess, the footprint of the oil sands mines, which is just only part of how they get oil out of the oil sands. The other side is completely sort of undisturbing the surface through steam assisted gravity drainage. So injecting steam to heat up the oil to actually produce it.
Was it who's the kid that was in Titanic?
Leonardo DiCaprio.
Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah. Wasn't he up there right? Thank you, Heather. Wasn't he right in there trying to stand up there in front of a really bad spot? But you nailed it, Graham. Isn't it not that bad? I mean, I've seen beautiful moose hunts right next to these. I'm just kidding on that, but I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, they're totally isolated mines. I mean, if you're looking at the vast amount of landscape up there, it's a very small footprint that's being used to actually get the oil out, especially from mining operations. And I mean, once these mining operations have finished, or even before they begin, they have to have incredibly robust remediation plans in place to completely infill the mines that they're pulling the oil out of. And so when these areas are finished, and you can see even satellite time-lapse images of this, of them being sort of closed up, they go back to normal completely, right? And if you're to say, compare that to a city, right? A city is going to use land to build buildings and so forth. It's never going to be remediated, right? And with those plans in place, it's like, it's going to go back to normal completely. And I think, some of the, I think it was Leonardo DiCaprio who actually complained about this, was talking about oil seeping to the surface, and he was relating that to mining. And it's just a nature of the way that the oil is up there. The McMurray Formation comes to the surface up there, and so the Athabasca River flowing through it actually cuts through the oil-bearing formation. So you get natural seepage into the river. It's been naturally seeping for thousands and thousands of years. It's not a product of these oil companies.
So I mean, you gotta love that. And Heather, as we come into our the end of the time here, I've had an absolute blast. But what you guys are probably going, this guy's a nut. But how do you go through and say for Q4 and then looking into 2023, what are your hot buttons as what you're looking for?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we've talked about, there's been a lot of excitement in the space so far. I think this was, pre-Inflation Reduction Act. Now with the Inflation Reduction Act, that's only accelerated what we've seen to date over the last, call it 6 months or so. So I'd likely anticipate over the next, few months here, we'll continue to see announcements over a broader range of emitters than we previously had. Like I mentioned this before, but economics look, more promising for a number of other sectors which previously had not, looked so great for. But even before this Inflation Reduction Act, we'd seen this kind of race to secure partnerships, be it with emitters, be it with storage, like our surface landowners for storage. And we've seen that in Louisiana through the report that we put out. But if anything, I think that will continue to accelerate. What I think, in the investment community is looking for now is signs of commerciality. It's one thing to announce projects. Anyone can announce a project, right? But you want to see that you've actually secured partnerships, that you're actually progressing permits, just signs to show that, this idea that we have is actually, we're moving it towards becoming a viable business.
Well, so you guys got your work cut out for you. And Graham, what do you see coming around the corner for you in your stuff?
Yeah, so I think mostly on just that subsurface risk component. It's something that we have to address, especially when looking at the just huge volume of these projects coming online. That be it, wellbore penetrations acting as leakage pathways for CO2, figuring out where the hotspots of that risk might be, and then further connecting the subsurface to the surface. So mapping out reservoirs that have potential for storage across North America, so that investment firms and individuals can de-risk these areas or understand where the most opportunity is.
I'll tell you, and again, thank you guys so much for your time. It is Friday. You guys are going to have a great weekend and everything. And so thank you very much for stopping by the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Stu. This is fun.